I truly had an epiphany, and I realized that I thought I went to medical school to cure cancer, prostate cancer, but I realized that nothing had changed since that phone call, and that my mission was a completely different one. That I wanted to be a cancer physician. I wanted to be up on the latest and know how to treat patients. But that dimension of knowing how to communicate and knowing how to, what I think is the role of a physician, to create and sustain hope, is what it's all about. And that's driven me since then for the last 3 decades.
If you've listened to the Hope Strategy podcast for a while, or if you're new around here, there's a good chance you've heard us mention MWI, which is Josh and I's digital marketing agency that we own and operate. None of the Hope Strategy podcast and the time and energy and effort that we've put into this would be possible without MWI and the amazing team that we have there and the work that we do, which allows us to do something like this that we love. We are a marketing agency that focuses on building and maintaining win-win partnerships with amazing brands. We've worked with small brands and helped them get off the ground, whether it's through social media marketing or building their websites. But we've also done consulting and large digital marketing projects for companies that you would have heard of, like Tempur-Pedic or Marriott or Hotels.com or Virgin Atlantic or a lot of other companies. Through listening to the podcast, we hope that you're enjoying it. And I would like to offer a free 20-minute consultation to anybody that listens to the podcast that's looking for some digital marketing help. Just go to mwi.com/hope strategy and sign up, and we'll reach out to you, and you will get a free 20-minute consultation with yours truly to talk about your digital marketing needs, to talk about your website, whatever questions you have. I'm happy to answer them. Really all with the intent to find ways to help your business thrive and grow online. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy podcast. Please reach out. I'd love to help you with your marketing. Welcome to another episode. For any of you fans of the Armchair Expert podcast, which is one of my favorites, that was a nod to him. Welcome to another episode of the Hope Strategy podcast. As always, I am here, Corey Blake, host of the Hope Strategy podcast. Joshua Steinley, my co-host and partner over here, is not on this episode, which happens from time to time, as I have missed a few as well. Today we had the chance to speak, I had the chance to speak with Ben Korn, Professor Ben Korn, Dr. Ben Korn, and we had a tremendous conversation that I am so anxious to get out into the world and for you to hear this. Ben Korn is professor and deputy director of the Shaare Zedek Cancer Center in Jerusalem. As a physician, his primary clinical interest is the treatment of brain tumors, such as glioblastoma. His passion is researching the science of hope. He has won the essay writing contest at Lancet Oncology, received the Israeli Citation for Volunteerism by President Shimon Peres, and most recently, the Humanitarian Award from the largest international society of oncologists. Through the organization Life's Door, which he founded with his soulmate, Dvorah, he devotes his intellectual energies to enlightening colleagues in medicine about the utility of hope for patients and providers. Guys, this conversation was a moment in the podcast that reinvigorated me. Not that I wasn't invigorated, but just restoked the flame on the podcast, because we had a chance to dive into the science of hope and the medical and biological side of hope, and then specifically discussed hope strategies that he has seen work for cancer patients and other patients that he's worked with in the most bleak circumstances. And I mean, the stories that Ben tells about why he got into medicine, examples and stories of while he's been in medicine. And then again, just the deeper dive that we took into what hope is and what it means. I was taking notes. I always take notes during our conversations, because I want to, keep track of the conversation and navigate it the best that I can and make sure not to miss anything. I took about 3 pages of notes, but it wasn't as an interviewer in this one. It was as a student, learning more about hope so that I can continue down this journey as we continue to seek out what a hope strategy is as we talk to these amazing people. You're going to love it. It really, truly was one for the record books. I talked to Ben off mic at the end and said, we want to have you on again for a part 2. I think there will be a part 2 of this episode to where we can continue talking because we spoke for about an hour and a half and I feel like there's still a lot more to uncover. So, smart, one of the smartest of guys that I've spoken with, and a great conversation. Please listen and enjoy this amazing conversation with Ben Korn.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty.
I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley. We just were talking before I started recording. I want to say first, it truly, truly is a pleasure to meet you, one. And yours is one of those bios that when I was going through and I was doing research, I was exhausted by the time I finished. I'm just like, how in the world have you accomplished so much? It was so inspiring, and I couldn't be more thrilled with the conversation today. Also more, I hope that I can do the conversation justice, because you are somebody that I think there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge and understanding that needs to get out through this conversation. And so I actually have another interview right after, and I pushed it back because I was like, hey, hopefully you've got some time, because I think there's a lot of stuff to dive into. And so I couldn't be more excited. But tell me what you were just telling me. I want the audience to hear about the dream that you had last night a little bit. That was hilarious. That cracked me up. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
if that's okay.
Sure. First of all, I'm probably like one of the true groupies of the Hope Strategy podcast. And I was mentioning to you that I've literally heard every episode up to date. And I kind of can't get enough of it. Part of it is a binge thing, and part of it is a cram thing, because I don't know, this almost feels like, I'm a physician. So in medicine, we have our oral board. So I almost feel like there's going to be an oral board exam here right now. So I wanted to hear everything. And that's just part of my OCD. But you're sort of in my subconscious. And so last night I had this dream, and I was mentioning how, when the podcast starts, before the music comes on and we hear Obama and everything, you and Josh have this informal banter between you, which is amazing. And what I was dreaming about was that, like, one of you says, well, it was bound to happen. Like, you say that. And then Josh goes, oh yeah, I know. That sucked. And you're like, yeah, seriously. I mean, who is this guy? Who put him up here? I mean, the guy, he's not really an entrepreneur, and he doesn't do triathlons, and he's never been to BYU. What's this all about? And then finally, Josh comes in because he's so scholarly, and he says, yeah, but the one good thing is that it means that there's going to be like an equivalent fantastic podcast coming our way. We should do an interview with whoever came up with the bell curve strategy, because that's what we need to talk about next for Hope. So anyway, I hope it doesn't disappoint you.
Oh my goodness, it couldn't be farther from the truth. I love the BYU tidbit too. That he's never even been to BYU. It's a common trend, I guess, throughout the people that we've talked to. It's funny, early on in the podcast when we did our first number of interviews, that when you do anything, you start with your network where people. And I went to BYU Hawaii, and I taught at BYU Hawaii for over 2 years, and Josh graduated. So you kind of go through, and obviously you're familiar with our faith and stuff. So it's kind of like, well, where do we start? You start with the people that you know, and certainly there was a lot of influential people, but some of the first feedback I got was like, almost looked at that as a negative thing. People were like, well, I don't want to listen to these Mormons talk to other Mormons. And it was, and I was like, well, a little judgmental. We're just trying to start with the people that we know. I let it slide right off my back, but it's been so fun as we've furthered the conversation to have, to expand that.
Oh yeah. It's really arborized since there. And I salute you for that. But I have to say, I mean, I'm fascinated by the Church of Latter-day Saints. I'm a religious person myself. We may or may not get into that. But you had this interview with, I guess, Elder Holland.
Yeah.
And that to me was very moving for many reasons. First of all, I think he's the only person who you've interviewed who's older than me. So that's a good thing. And second, there was that story that you told. I'm sure it was just a minor story, but to me it resonated, where you're like on the plane, and you're like going down the aisle, and like, all of us know you have no patience for anybody not moving it along in the aisle of the plane. Yeah. And all of a sudden you stop and you thank him and he blesses you. And I could just feel that. I just felt it was so genuine about how there was such care on both sides and gratitude. I thought that was very moving. Yeah,
I just as you're saying it now, I'm getting that same feeling again. It was one of those full circle moments. Josh and I spoke when we were planning the podcast, and take religion out of it, but just the amount of as an academic, as a speaker, as somebody who really is just trying to provide hope to the world. He's kind of I've been seeing him my whole life, but he's kind of the epitome of that. And so we said before the podcast, I was doing all this research, and none of these guys, none of the apostles for the church, or none of the prophets or whatever, they've never been on a podcast. And so I said, man, wouldn't that be something else if we could get Jeffrey R. Holland, this guy that all he does is talk about hope, on the podcast? Let's put that on like the maybe someday list. And before we even recorded the first episode, we had somehow worked a connection, and he had agreed to be on the podcast, episode 8. So we're like, whoa, well, I guess we did it. We climbed the mountaintop. We got to the top.
I told my wife, I'm sure you'll hear about Devorah in this conversation. I told her, I'm giving you about till March of 2021 before you have Obama on.
Oh, wow. That would be, hey, anybody out there that knows Obama, has a connection to Obama, Corey at mwi.com. Get over to me. Okay. So Ben, you, I want to start just like we do with everybody, kind of start at the beginning. I love the human experience, and I feel that in order to truly understand the whys and the hows of people's accomplishments later in life, it's really important to understand where the heck they're coming from and what kind of formed them. And so I know your upbringing, based on my research, was interesting, and ups and downs. And so I want to start at the very beginning. What was your family like? What was growing up like? What lessons did you learn growing up in the family that you grew up in, and in the place that you grew up in?
I'm kind of a very stereotypic Jewish kid from Brooklyn. And although now I reside in Israel, maybe we could talk about that too later.
Definitely.
And I grew up in just one of these, almost like Jewish ghettos. I practically didn't know any non-Jews when I was growing up. It was an extremely sheltered existence. I went to a religious school. I was very involved in my synagogue, as a choir boy, and later leading youth groups and the like. I was expected to go into medicine like every good Jewish kid, and I actually, at the beginning, I think you mentioned in your interview that you were on a track to be a dentist. I, for a long time, wanted to be a dentist too. I was pretty good with my hands. And like when you make that 4th grade model out of clay, I did a tooth. I really thought that's where I was headed. And then just something quite dramatic happened when I was 11 years old, which absolutely changed my life and my trajectory and made me grow up really fast.
So were your parents, what did your parents do for work?
My mom was an educator. She was a teacher in the New York City public school system, and then she became a principal. A brilliant woman. She went to college when she was 16 years old.
Oh, wow.
And she, straight A's, and she wanted to really become a professor of mathematics.
Okay.
And this was like the 1940s, and some associate dean sits her down and says, listen, dear, there's no future for a woman in math. And he basically shunts her over to teaching. And that created a lot of frustration for her. And I think sensitized me to a lot of, let's say, feminist issues, because I just thought it was very unfair. As fate would have it, I'm the father of 4 daughters. And, I'm a very successful professional woman. And I think, trying to be very encouraging of them to pursue whatever their dreams could be. So that was my mom. And my dad was a furrier. It's kind of a politically incorrect profession these days.
Yeah.
But it it was a family business that was started by his dad, and he and my uncle became the heir apparents and went into the business together. Probably never got along a day after they went into the business together. It's one of those, family split up stories.
Yeah.
I actually remember speaking to him at one point when it was so obvious that it was politically incorrect to be in that business. And I said, just aside from, let's say, the ethics of it, I mean, don't you think that business is destined to fail? And I remember him telling me, he said, we were living in New York. He goes, you know what? One cold winter and all of that goes out the window. And people are like, there's nothing keeps you warm like a fur.
Yeah.
And he had an incredible fur salon in Manhattan where all the, you're very young, but there was a movie star in those days called Anne Margaret. She was going out with the quarterback who won the Super Bowl for the Jets, Joe Namath.
Oh, Joe Namath, yeah. Hollywood Joe, right? Or Joe, was it Joe Hollywood or Hollywood Joe? What'd they call him?
Yeah, exactly. Joe Willie Namath. And there's a picture of Joe Namath and Anne Margaret coming in and buying furs in their salon. And
yeah,
it was that kind of storied existence.
I can't imagine, especially back then. That was it. That was the validation and credibility the store needed to have Joe Namath coming in wearing a fur.
Yeah, it was like 1970, like right after he won. Too. Yeah, it was a nice thing.
It's funny because you said furrier, and I'm like, I think I know I assume that's what that is. I think I've heard that before. I just Googled. I'm like, okay. as you were saying that, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's what I thought. Dealing in is buying and selling and dealing in furs, which again, yeah, is an industry in the U.S. anyway that's not obsolete, I guess, at this point. So you mentioned this before, and we'll jump into it. You had, as a kid, you kind of know the trajectory. You think as much as as a little kid, the trajectory of life and kind of what's expected of you. I was so moved and touched by the story of your father and this experience you had. You said age 11, and I'd love it if you could walk us through that story. And then I've got plenty of follow-up questions on some of the hows and whys of it. But could you walk us through that story of your dad?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thanks for letting me share it. When I was 11, as I said, my dad was a businessman, and between the ages of about 9 and 11, he was taking an incredible number of business trips, which is at least what my parents were telling us.
In quotes,
and
yeah.
He'd be on the phone calling us from all sorts of exotic spots. But really, he was at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in Manhattan, getting a variety of treatments for a really advanced case of prostate cancer. And my parents, out of sheer love, decided, again, this is the 1970s, and they decided that it would be best to shield us from that reality.
It was for 2 years.
Yeah, that's right. 2 years since the diagnosis. And part of it is they observed one of my best friends who, when we were in 4th grade, was told by his parents that his father had a very advanced form of cancer. And he would almost be going home from school every day to check if dad was still alive.
Yeah.
And, again, his parents were extremely well-intentioned too. They took a different tack. And my parents just decided that it would be best to shield us, that a child deserves innocence, and there was no reason to burden us with that.
Yeah.
And then about a week before he eventually passes away, they realized that they had to begin to orient us to what was to become a new reality. Now, you might say, Ben, you sound like a smart guy. You're a medical school graduate. My siblings have done okay too. How could you not be aware of all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Even at the tender young age of 9 or 10. And I guess the answer is that maybe we had a sense, but a child just doesn't want to think that way. A child wants to just believe that their parents are invincible. And we found a way to delude ourselves into thinking that was the case. But the mask was removed when, about a week before he died, we were brought into the hospital, and we saw our father. And I've told the story so many times, and I'm just always getting emotional about it. So a little bit more about background of my dad. My dad was very athletic. He was very bright and very athletic. He went to City College, and he lettered in several sports, including track and boxing. And the most prominent part of his physique were his legs. They were just so muscular, and they looked like oak trees.
Yeah.
And when we got into the room and saw him, first of all, in this gown, which we just never seen him in that before. And I looked down at his legs, and they were just these spindles. Yeah. And just like the whole thing changed. And he was in tremendous pain because his prostate cancer had metastasized to his bones. And because of the pain, now I'm a cancer physician myself, and so it's very clear in retrospect that he was over-medicated with opioids. And he was, in retrospect, what we now would call, he was worked out. He was just hazy, and he knew it was us, but it wasn't an interaction. Mm-hmm. And it turns out this was the holiday of Passover. And as I mentioned, we were religious Jews, and there's kind of like a menu that comes around. Like now it's all done digitally, but then they used to literally give you this laminated menu that you would pick your food. And he kind of gave us this menu, and he couldn't speak. And I was 11 years old, and I was kind of like, I started laughing because I thought it was so bizarre.
Yeah, and it's a defense mechanism for an 11-year-old as well, who's facing this immediate traumatic experience, trying to digest and comprehend what in the world is going on. Naturally, that's a defense mechanism to say, I guess I'll try to laugh my way through this a little bit, I'm guessing.
Right. So anyway, all of a sudden, like in the side of my ribs, I feel this poke, and it's my brother who's about a year older than me. And he's basically saying, like, you better man up, because things have changed. He put it together really fast. And then I did also. And he basically said that our father was kind of inviting us to lunch, that he wanted to have us join him. And so I kind of circled like a tuna sandwich, which, by the way, the whole thing's bizarre because it was Passover, so we're really not even allowed to eat bread then. So that's what I picked. Even that was kind of funny. Anyway, we went home. We didn't really discuss it because there was this denial in the family. We went home by mass transit in the New York City subway system, and not a word was mentioned. And then a couple of days later, for the listeners who don't know, if you're a religious Jewish person, that the holiday is actually about 8 days. And at the beginning days, when we do the Seder, and the final days, there are these restrictions. Like, for instance, an Orthodox Jew wouldn't answer a phone. So on the 7th day, where all these restrictions pertain, the phone rings. And we hadn't mentioned a word about this whole thing, but everybody knew that phone was the call. And so it's one of these, homes where we had all these little extension phones, and everybody kind of picks up a phone. And there's a young physician on the other end. And he says to my mom, he says, Mrs. Korn? And she says, yes. I'm quoting now. And he says, this is Dr. So-and-so. I need to inform you that your husband has expired. And I got to tell you, I'm a cancer doctor. I've never heard anybody use that word. I mean, to use the word expire is like, use that word for like, cottage cheese that goes bad.
Yeah.
And this is like what he says.
Poor choice of words. Yeah.
Yeah, to say the least. And then there's a little pause. And his follow-on is, can we do an autopsy?
Jeez.
And yeah, it was really intense. And my mother, kind of drops the phone, and we have to help her. And I'm just bawling because I feel, and I think the article that you read, I feel like I'm an orphan in a Dickens novel.
Yeah.
And I really assume that, it's curtains and that there's just no future for us at all. And then my older brother, who I really didn't talk to a lot then, he takes exactly that same arm that had poked me in the hospital room, and he kind of pulls me in to, if you will, to his bosom, which is like really just a concave chest. He's not developed yet, you know. But he says to me, he goes, Benji, it's going to be okay. And I felt just so reassured just by those simple words and just by his presence. And I actually knew it would be okay. And overall, it was okay, because my dad had been a provider, and, you know, we put away funds for us to go to school, and my mom was fantastic. But there's kind of a PS on the story, which I just want to tell you as well, because it's not in that article. And that is, so a few years later, I decide, you know, I want to go into medical school. I want to be a physician. That's really what shunted me out of dentistry and said, okay, you know, jeepers, I need to be a doctor, and not just a doctor. I need to be a cancer doctor, and not just a cancer doctor. I need to find the cure for prostate cancer. And like, you know, you write the essays for school, for college, and for graduate school. So my essay is all about these idealistic notions of the science of malignant disease and what I'm going to do. So I get to medical school, and you know, the way medical school works in the U.S. is the first 2 years you're in classrooms, and then the next 2 years you're kind of on the hospital ward learning your craft. So I get to the hospital ward, and literally my first patient, it turns out, is someone with cancer. And not only is it a cancer, but it's metastasized to the brain. So the way your training works is you, as a medical student or as an intern, you see the case, and there's a hierarchy. You then present it to the senior physician, who's called the attending. And my senior physician is one of these world experts. In those days, this will date it, you would call these people a TWA professor. In other words, they're always on. There was an airline in those days called Trans World Airlines. Yeah. They were always on the TWA flight. They were never at home. They were always invited to lecture. And she's just brilliant. So I go outside the room and I present this case to this incredibly brilliant physician. And then we come into the room, and she kind of looks at the patient and the family, and she says, it's brain mets. You need radiation for 2 weeks. We'll start on Monday. And then we left the room. At that moment, I truly had an epiphany, and I realized that I thought I went to medical school to cure cancer, prostate cancer, but I realized that nothing had changed since that phone call, and that my mission was a completely different one, that I wanted to be a cancer physician. I wanted to be up on the latest and know how to treat patients. But that dimension of knowing how to communicate and knowing how to, what I think is the role of a physician, to create and sustain hope, is what it's all about. And that's driven me since then for the last 3 decades.
That story is so, I appreciate you sharing it with us in the detail that you did. I think it's so inspiring to hear how a traumatic event like that as an 11-year-old can, even as an 11-year-old, again, I have a 9-year-old, right? And I'm starting to understand, like, you know, he's taking things in, he's taking all these outside stimuli a little differently than he was a year ago. And he's responding differently to the world around him. And he's here to think that as an 11-year-old, you were able to immediately strengthen a bond with a brother because of a difficult situation and a parent. And then also take that and turn it into this career that you've turned it into is so inspiring. And so there's so much to dissect and kind of go through in all of this. So I want to understand a couple of things. One, and it's just a small note, but one of the things, one thing is you're an unbelievable writer. I just want to compliment you on that. I read quite a few things that you've written, and it's just got a flow to it, and it's easy to read, and you can feel it when you're reading it. Seriously, super good. I read a lot of stuff, and I was just the whole time I was like, man, I could keep reading this, and this is something I don't even know much about. It was a different time. It was the way that you communicated with, you're a mother to a son was different than the way that we talked about feelings and emotions and psychology and mental health and all these things were so different then. I mean, But one of the things that I recognized in what you wrote is that you had no ill will towards that resident or physician, whoever it was. And you kind of, now with context, you can say he probably was just a resident that was brand new. Maybe it was the first time he's ever done this, and it would be easy to be bitter and to have that turn into a bitterness towards doctor, which imagine if you said the family decided our stance on this is going to be doctors are bad. They're bad communicators. We're bitter towards and so, but instead it was kind of as you've learned more and stuff, you have an empathy. Where does that come from? Is that a stance that the whole family took? Did you guys all is that something you've discussed since, that empathy that you were able to have towards this, because again, that was a very pivotal moment. It could have been one of bitterness and getting really angry versus, we're going to take this as a grain of salt and move forward.
It's a great question. And by the way, I just want to tell you, you and Josh are just phenomenal interviewers. I'd love to, in fact, I've begun to have my medical students and residents listen to this podcast because I think they can learn a lot from just your curiosity. And I think from that, there are just insights that develop. You had an interview with, I forget his name, might have been like Tyler or Taylor Farnsworth or something.
Tyler Farnsworth, yeah.
Way back when. He made a point about empathy kind of flowing from the knowledge that you have in another person. I'm not quoting him exactly right, but he said something to the effect that the more I get to know another human being, the more I can feel for that other human being and understand what makes him or her tick. And I think that's a lot of what the spirit was in my family, that we try to really be very broad-minded about understanding a person and a context. And once you do that, I think then the pieces begin to fit together. And you're right, it would be very easy to have a default of saying, I'm just pissed off at the medical system and to be angry. But another response could be, like any of us, that person was flawed. And there's always the opportunity for repair. And I think that's a lot of what drives me and the other people in my family to make things better, to understand that there are always going to be these problems and these obstacles, and to know that we can use those as springboards for growth.
A message that the world could definitely use right now is that type of empathy. So talk to me about, I'm so curious, in the Jewish tradition, especially growing up in a family that was, religious Jewish family, how does the faith influence your take on death and the afterlife? And I mean, how did you guys understand that as a family, or what was your belief on, okay, dad's passed away, now this is what that means?
Right. Well, it really was a faith-based upbringing. And to follow up on your previous question and to connect the two together about, the threshold to be bitter, let's say. So, some people say to me, well, like, weren't you angry with the rabbi? Where was he in this story? Mm-hmm. And even then, all those years back, people just did not have the orientation to try and deal with these kind of life events. It sounds preposterous now, but rabbis weren't equipped. I mean, my wife and I started an organization. Part of our mission is to train leaders of faith-based communities to get more comfortable with any of these hardships that all of us confront as part of the human experience. But it just wasn't being done then.
Yeah.
And yet the idea of having faith, to me, is very empowering. Right now I work in Jerusalem. Previously I worked in Tel Aviv. I emigrated about 20 years ago. Tel Aviv, for those that don't know, is kind of like the secular capital of Israel. And in my hospital, which is the municipal hospital in Tel Aviv, I was kind of really in the minority as being a religious person. And it was not unusual for a patient of mine who did not have God in their life or a faith-based community to make comments to the effect of, I'm envious of you. I wish I was a believer. And they wanted a follow-on question, so I would try and probe a little bit. And most commonly, what I would hear is, first of all, you have a community that supports you. Secondly, you believe in an afterlife, so that must be reassuring for you. And third, you believe in miracle. And it was like remarkable. I'd really never thought about it till I heard these comments consistently, but not to have the opportunity for miracle in my life would really be a downer. And I guess we could all talk about how we define miracle, but even, and we can argue about that, but just to be able to identify something as miraculous, it's really uplifting. Mm-hmm. And it really creates a tremendous amount of gratitude when the things that we all take for granted can be looked at in the light of miracle. It changes the way you perceive the mundane.
Yeah, and a lot of times there's a it depends on who you're talking to, but potentially a negative connotation with miracles where it's some sort of whimsical, magical, thing that happens. And it's easy to be very cynical as it pertains to the idea of miracles. But I like that you're saying that it depends on, there's so many different ways to look at it. You can wake up in the morning and open your eyes and say, well, that's miraculous. I woke up again. I just laid here with my eyes closed for 8 hours and here I go again. It's that in and of itself, or a kid being born or whatever it might be. But then there's obviously the miraculous that is somebody having cancer and then not having cancer, inexplicably or whatever it might be. But yeah, that's good context to look at, especially from somebody who's seen as much as you've seen as it pertains to health and wellness and death, as from a disease.
Yeah, and I mean, I really do feel that I travel with a community, and I feel that that community is accompanied by an accessible God, and I never preach this stuff. I almost would say I run away from it. People know that I'm identified with a certain faith, but I don't have as an agenda to, do missionary work. That's not where I'm coming from, but I'm very grateful that this is part of who I am. Yeah.
No, I understand that. So real quick, just because I'm still curious on what is the Jewish tradition as it pertains to the passing of a loved one?
First of all, I guess maybe I could say this, but you said the Jewish, there's never like one Jewish position.
Yeah. Give me all of the Jew. That's what we're going to spend the next 4 hours talking about.
How much time do we got? So, but I think there is kind of a normative Jewish view, which is frankly that, what I'm looking at, sitting over there in Arizona, or what you're looking at sitting over here in Jerusalem, that's an envelope. And that envelope really encases a soul. And I think most Jewish philosophers would say that the soul is eternal. And, my dimples and my freckles aren't going to be around forever. But this soul, I believe, is going to be eternal. And that's what I'm most interested in doing, in nourishing that soul and helping others to nourish their souls. Again, not necessarily in a strict, obsessive, adhere to the faith religious way. But I think that if you look at something like the 10 Commandments, the fifth commandment, to honor your parents, I just think that is nourishing. And probably, you're a father of 4 now, and you probably just see the reciprocal value of respect, that you've had for elders, and the respect you want to inculcate in your children. And what a wonderful gift that is for them to be respectful. That, I believe, really nourishes the soul. And I think there's tremendous value to that.
I can't imagine how much there is to cover between this experience as an 11-year-old, the decision to become a physician, and then to be, since then, so much has happened. I want to go real quick to your wife. Is it Devorah? Is that her name?
Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
So obviously this is a critical, important piece of your life and part of your life. There's another pivotal moment. How did you meet your wife? When did that all happen? And tell me a little bit about that relationship.
Right. So we were both undergrads at Boston University, and I was kind of vacillating. I did pretty well in high school of whether I wanted to go to, one of these Ivy League colleges, which, my grades I think, I know I got into some of them, and or because I was so gung-ho on being a physician. And again, this is an era where being pre-med meant like sabotaging people's laboratory experiments. You might have heard some of those stories. It was competitive to get in.
Yeah. So
I was accepted to one of these BAMD programs, a 6-year medical program. And I had tremendous, almost cognitive dissonance about, am I foregoing my education just for the sake of a career? Anyway, I got to Boston University, and like just about the first day I met Devora. And it didn't take long for me to realize that this also felt like almost, Providence intervening, that aside from the fact that I believe I got a great education there, I met this partner who is truly a soulmate. And she's an extremely unique person in that she's has organizational brilliance and tremendous creativity, started a successful business herself. But beyond a great mother, now a great grandmother, I mean, not a great grandmother.
Got it.
We're not that old. But she just kind of bubbles with confidence and in a very infectious way. And when she's the kind of person, I'm sure you know people like this, that when you're in her presence, you believe more in yourself. And that's an amazing thing to impart to others, because I had tremendous insecurities and I really wasn't sure I could do a lot of things. And she was somebody who would say like, oh no, you can do it. And she would say stuff like that. And, it was just believable. And any of the things that have happened to me, there's just zero chance that they would have happened if I wasn't paired up with Devora. That's something that's unassailable.
I think that's that one of the highest compliments you can give somebody. One that that I've heard, especially for a spouse. Shout out to any amazing spouses, because I would be in the same category as you with my wife. Bridget is and if she's listening to this, you're the best. But she truly, I'm the same as you, riddled with insecurities and doubt, and also not having come from again, I don't want to say I didn't come from much. I grew up in a military family that was it. It was, I didn't know much else. I lived on a military base and my dad served in the military and he worked his job. It was just kind of, I didn't have much of a broader perspective of the world in many ways. And so I remember I've had so many of those conversations where even if I didn't say it out loud, in the 12 years that we've been married, she's been able to sniff out the insecurity and reaffirm, no, why wouldn't you be? They can do it. Why can't you do it? Or why not do it? She's built up my confidence, and I share that with you. I understand that. I can completely understand where you're coming from. It's a game changer, and it's such a good lesson to learn, not just in a relationship with your spouse but with friends and partners and whatever it might be, being the type of person that helps people feel better about themselves and feel confidence in themselves. I don't know that there's anything more powerful in a relationship than just instilling that in the people around you.
Yeah. And it really also means, and as we get into speaking more about, at least, I guess maybe some of my view of hopefulness, that's just one of the things that we can do on a micro level, that we all have that ability to some extent. Some do it better than others. Bridget might do it better than Priscilla across the street. But to some extent, we all have that gift to share with someone. And that's huge.
Yeah. So we're going to jump way ahead now. So you're currently the deputy director of and you're going to have to help me pronounce, is it Sha'ar?
Yeah, I want to hear you struggle with it, actually.
Sha'ar Zadek Cancer Center in Jerusalem?
Good. That's good. It means Gates of Justice.
Okay. Let's just say Gates of Justice. You're the deputy director of the Gates of Justice Cancer Center in Jerusalem. So how does it pronounce exactly?
It's Sha'arei Tzedek.
Okay, yeah. Sha'arei Tzedek. Cancer Center in Jerusalem. You're from New York, like you said, good New York boy, and now you're in Jerusalem, which, by the way, at some point in the future, I have to come to Jerusalem. Like there's
got to get from here.
It's probably top of the travel list. Like I need to get there. I need to see it. I need to feel it. I need to experience it. And so when I do, we'll have to meet up. But tell me that story. I mean, I'm sure it's a really long story, but how did you end up in Israel? And then how did you end up in Jerusalem? Again,
in a way, part of the upbringing of a religious person, when you look at the prayers, when you read the scripture, you see that there's kind of an arc of the story in the scripture of the Jewish people, making their way from an exodus out of slavery and eventually into a promised land, which is geographically Israel as we know. And I really have no interest in getting into politics, here, but the prayers are about a return to Zion. And so there's sort of a belief that there's like a national, a way to almost have national self-fulfillment of Judaism through inhabiting this land. It sounds a little funky. When people speak about a chosen people, it in a way sounds very aloof and distancing, but the actual implication of chosenness is absolutely that you have responsibility, that there's nothing to be lorded over anyone else, but rather there is this notion of a light unto the nations, that if you have identified some discovery, some new drug, that immediately needs to be shared, that mankind needs to be the beneficiary of whatever might happen. So somewhere tucked away in the religious upbringing of a Jewish person is this idea of returning to a land. Now, it's a very funky idea. And, life was really good in America. This was not like, let's say, the experience that European Jews had in the 1930s and 40s, where there was National Socialism and you had to, get your butt out of Germany, or else, the Nazis were going to do something else. It wasn't that feeling at all. I mean, it's a very good life. I mean, I believe there's, despite all the difficulties that we all observed a week ago, I think America is still defined by exceptionalism. And I'm extremely grateful for being raised in such an amazing, amazing country. And yet there was always this idea that maybe we could make it across the pond. So what happened is, to make a long story really short, when you're in academic medicine, the idea is to just keep getting promoted on this ladder. You go from an assistant professor to an associate professor to a full professor. So I got pretty lucky and I was very productive with publications. And at a very young age, I was kind of on the cusp of getting full professorship or not. I was 36 years old.
Wow.
And this is not the most pleasant story, but it has a silver lining too. So basically, the chairman of my department decided he wanted to invest in me. And I had the credentials, but the age almost was working against me, because these promotion committees just don't want to let a 36-year-old get that title. But he pushed. One of the benefits at my institution when you get that title is you get a half a year of sabbatical time. So I got 6 months of time, and I said to the chairman, I said, if it's okay, we have this idea that instead of just taking a block of 6 months, can I spread that out over a year? And it would be really cool if my family could be in Israel for the year, because especially my wife has all these cousins, and we thought it'd be amazing for our kids. So could I be like 2 weeks in Israel and 2 weeks in Philadelphia? And that's what I did for a year.
Wow.
Almost using the plane as a train. I was just coming. How long
of a trip is that?
It's about 11 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. But your body just adjusts to it, and it becomes like nothing. You learn how to sleep, and you learn how to, But anyway, what happened was, at the end of the year, it was clear that my family loved it. And it was clear that we actually wanted to make a change. And so you got to imagine, I basically had to go back to this chairman now, who had done.
You didn't want it to feel like a bait and switch, right?
Yeah, it was a terrible feeling.
Yeah.
And we eventually worked through that, and we did a transition. But that's really how we ended up there. And it's really been, Israel is only about 70 years old, and you might know that it's called, because you're so much a part of the entrepreneurial world, it's called the Startup Nation. Mm-hmm. It was a bestseller by that title. And it's like everybody is in, high tech or biotech, and, everybody wants to be a CEO. And there's just an electricity in the air throughout Israel. And it's very exciting. I mean, You might see it on TV portrayed as, a country always on the brink of war, but when you're living in Israel, you don't feel that. You feel actually, as you'll see when you get here, you feel very safe, and you just feel this dynamism of things just really moving. It's a lot of fun.
I love the I don't even know how to really word this, but just the fact that you moved your family and you had this draw to a place based on convictions that you held religiously and personally. I don't know what it is about that, but historically that's such a common thing, right? It's not just what you believe and, the tangible of where you are, whatever, but historically there's this idea of Zion or a promised land or whatever it's, right. And so I love that was the motivation behind it. I don't really have anything else to say other than that's I love it. That's and I wouldn't have thought
it really was an issue of idealism. It wasn't like opportunism. Yeah, it was more idealism. Although a lot of opportunities flowered from it, as it turned out.
Yeah, and you heard the conversation with Josh with his experience to it's different. It wasn't as much of a religious, conviction based on, a place, but it was the experience of we need to go adopt. They just knew it was just that we need to go adopt a child from China. And again, it wasn't an opportunist thing. It wasn't like, let's go there and start a business. And maybe it was the other way around. And yeah, it's, when you do that, when you follow your gut, it promotes action and doing. And so typically when you start, whether you can add in whatever other elements you want, spiritual or other miracles, whatever you want, but really if you're just acting and doing and taking advantage of the opportunities ahead of you, then good things tend to happen and opportunities create themselves or, are presented in front of you. So, you got into, so you mentioned Startup Nation, you started a business when you were in Israel, right? So you kind of went from just doing medicine and being a practicing physician and to business. What was the business that you started initially? I know there's been quite a few different.
Okay, so first of all, I was a co-founder. There was someone else who kind of started it. His name was Morris Laster, and he kind of thought that it might be interesting to me, and it really was. It was a business called Keryx, K-E-R-Y-X, biopharmaceuticals, and we did two things in that business. One, there was a platform technology. I don't know if you or your listeners are familiar with this. Right now, one of the exciting things in cancer medicine are these tyrosine kinase inhibitors. You take this enzyme called the TK, and you can kind of manipulate that. And it turns out many cancers thrive on having that enzyme intact. And so when you can kind of muck up the machinery of that enzyme, you might be able to forestall the growth of a cancer. And this is one of the first companies that looked at that idea and in fact had ways to spawn a series of drugs, not just one drug. Simultaneously, we decided, since that was kind of the exciting idea, but we wanted to have something substantial. So we also in-licensed some products for complications of diabetes. And we eventually did an IPO on both the London AIM and on the NASDAQ. And it was a nice model because it was sort of a great hedge in that you had some investors who wanted to go on product that very soon could be sold with diabetic complications. And you had other investors who were dreamers and wanted to, take a ride on the possibility of tyrosine kinase inhibition really being the way to manipulate cancer in the future. So we did that, and we made a few bucks, and it was really eye-opening. I'll tell you the truth. I actually tell all medical students that they should spend at least 6 months in that environment. First of all, I think it's an incredibly powerful thing to behold the way an entrepreneur thinks and to see what creativity and inventiveness is all about. And anybody who's listened to any number of episodes on this podcast knows what I'm talking about. Secondly, it's fascinating to understand how the FDA works. When you're a naive medical student, you assume there are some, clinical problems and there are questions we can define. And then you say, well, how come we're only trying to answer some of the questions and not others? The answer is really because the FDA and the people who provide grants really decide what are the burning questions? And it's really eye-opening to understand what are the drivers in medicine. It's very sobering sometimes, but then if you're smart, you can say, well, that's a question that's not only valid, but people are going to want to answer it. So you start doing things to position yourself to answer the questions. And I think it's really eye-opening for young physicians. And I think, by the way, you probably know this. Today's medical student in America, it's a very interesting set of demographics. First of all, it's about 60% female, the class right now. About 20% of medical students today are simultaneously getting an MBA.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I have a brother-in-law who's an ER doctor, who's been out of residency for a couple of years now, and he's talked to me a lot about that. Is so many of the people that he studied with, and he himself, he's thinking about getting an MBA because of the opportunity that creates itself when you're able to couple this knowledge and expertise that you spent years and years developing, and all of this experience you're getting on a daily basis in the ER, and how to help people and benefit people, all these different things. But you didn't learn a single thing about how to turn that into a business or create a spreadsheet, so it's
amazing. Just two really quick comments on that. You have, because the selection and entrance criteria for medical school that, these are bright kids.
Yeah.
Yet they're so far behind on basic business principles. And as you see from what I've done, we're way behind on the digital. There's no excuse for it, but we've managed to just keep ourselves out of it. And that's beginning to change now. But that's a business for MWI right there, to somehow bring us in kicking and screaming to the 21st century.
We've actually had a lot of success working with what we call like late adopters. There's all the early adopters of technology that are clearly there, and hardware and software and all these things. But medicine is one of those fields that, because the expertise is there and because the abilities are there and the necessity for the craft is there, that they've been able to get by without really utilizing a lot of the tools that you need.
One of the podcasts that I really liked was the one you did with, I think his name was Daniel Robinson. So I just very quickly, so he speaks openly about the fact that he spent 11 years in prison. Mm-hmm. And it was like specifically that 11-year segment when Facebook and Twitter and everything's going live. And he comes out and he wants to start a business. And, he's in prison. So, you get your last phone call and then you can't use a digital phone. And he's like, what is this? He was in prison for 11 years. Like, what's my excuse that I still don't know what Instagram is?
Oh, you've accomplished plenty without knowing what Instagram is. That should be the least of your concerns. So what was the transition from Israel to moving to Jerusalem?
Right. So Jerusalem is an amazing town because it is that, in that it really is this epicenter for these major faiths of the Western world. The passion is really there. The holy sites are there for you to see. Anybody who comes to Israel, just needs to start, I think, in Jerusalem. There are many outlying places that you need to see, but Jerusalem just is where it all begins, and it's where everyone's, energies are directed. And it does. You can't help but have translation on the day to day. I can go into, in my hospital, most of the rooms are not private rooms. And I can walk in on rounds to just very intense conversations between, let's say, a Jewish Israeli and a Palestinian, and all their families are there. And there might be, a few months ago, I literally walked in on a conversation of the intensity of suffering. What is it to be suffering as a descendant of Holocaust survivors versus what is it to be suffering as a Palestinian without yet having statehood, and issues of the different prophets. It's a very stark society. I almost the term I use is raw. There's a rawness to life in Israel, in that there's much more bluntness in Israel. People, things that are so taboo in America. People speak about how much money they're earning. People speak about who they voted for. People tell you why, you can't be serious about voting for another candidate. Religious divides. It just makes for very stimulating conversation. And it takes a long time when you come from the environment that I grew up in, that I'm sure to some extent you grew up in, to say, well, wow, where's the politeness? What's this all about? This term, which I didn't know until I got here and I looked it up. It's to transmogrify. Basically, it just means this complete it's not just change. It's this drastic metamorphosis where your ground shakes underneath you because so many things that you took for granted have now just been shifted seismically. And that's the experience of an immigrant in many ways. And that was a very healthy thing. On the first level, it was very unsettling for us as a family. But on another level, it provided a tremendous growth opportunity and forces you to reassess what your priorities are, what's important to you, what are your goals. And to do that self-assessment, that kind of a check-in is incredibly healthy, and I encourage people to pursue it. But I wouldn't have done it unless I was thrust into that.
Yeah, it's perspective. The more you travel, the more you see, and then especially when you go and live. I mean, I've lived in other countries and other cultures and learned other languages, and you gain a perspective from the cultural standpoint that you just otherwise can't get, and it opens your eyes to the way that other people do. I mean, there's nothing better in my mind, whether it's the perspective that you gain as a 16-year-old versus, seeing a 10-year-old when you used to be in that seat, or, somebody living in Jerusalem or Israel who, I hear about these things on the news all the times. I know that there's conflict. I know that it's raw based off of what I've heard, but I would never put that word on it because I haven't been there to see it, to feel it, to experience it, which is that's a game changer. Okay. So let's get into hope more specifically. We've obviously touched on themes of hope all throughout here. I was so fascinated by the writings that you've done and what I was able to get my hands on. When Josh and I started the podcast, we're hopeful people, we're optimistic people, we're ambitious people. We believe that there is good in the world. And early in 2020, when it was hard to come by that anywhere you looked, or the conversations you were having, I mean, as you know, from one day to the next, it seems things got pretty bleak. And so we had always taught, he and I, we just tend to have an abundance mentality about things. There's a bump in the road. Well, there's an opportunity here somewhere. Not that we're, it's not all rainbows and butterflies, as I've said before. There's the moments of getting down and getting kicked and feeling terrible or feeling anxious or depressed. But there's an end belief that, if we just keep putting in the work and we keep at it, then these difficulties, these trials, these tribulations we'll look back and have learned something from them. And there's hope in that. And so we talk about that for years. We've been working together for 7+ years, and that's just a kind of a theme. Not that that we had really even taken head on. We just who we are. The podcast, though, we said we were coming up with names. We just had a brainstorm session. We had like 100 names of some things pertaining to hope. And I said, what about the hope strategy? And you always hear that hope is not a strategy. That's something that's pretty common, especially in business. You hear of a lot of guys that, pound the pulpit and say, hope is not, and sure, if I've said this before, but if you just think, I'm just going to sit around and be hopeful, of course, that's not a strategy. That's a very basic way to look at it, in my opinion. But in my experience, and from the people I've spoken with here and elsewhere, hope is at the core of the strategies to come. And if the strategies that you're creating in order to live a successful, happy, healthy, abundant life, if those strategies, the different things that you're implementing, the processes you're putting into place, the decisions you're making, if they have a foundation of hope, that was the idea, but we didn't even define, and I still don't know what the definition of what is the hope strategy. A lot of people have asked me that. So what is the hope strategy? Like expecting me to have like a statement. Well, the hope strategy is this. It's kind of, if anything, it's this journey that we're on to continue to understand how strategies can benefit, how life strategies and goals and everything can benefit from this foundation of hope. So all of that being said, I was so intrigued to read the writings of a professional, of a doctor, of a physician who has, and again, let's tie in a very important piece to this is in oncology and cancer, because that is such a traditionally hopeless word and experience. Nobody wants to hear. I heard you mention in an interview I found on YouTube, where you had said, the C word, they call it, or, I remember my grandpa got cancer, and that's the thing you don't want to hear. And it's immediately, if there's any hope in the room you're sitting in, the second somebody says cancer, the hope seems to be gone. And so somebody who has seen that on the front lines and worked to treat that and empathize with people who are struggling in this difficult thing where there seems to be no hope. The fact that you've taken that situation and that life experience and said, I'm going to use my expertise and knowledge to now study hope and define hope and create, mechanisms and things and systems that will help me help my patients find hope. And not only just because it might make them feel better, but because you truly, from what I've seen, you truly believe that instilling this hope in hopeless situations, there's a science to it. There's a method to it that can actually help outcomes, not cure outcomes, but help with the process of getting to outcomes. So just now it's time for me to shut my mouth and preface it with all of that, but now be educated on hope by you, an expert who studied it and who has seen it and who has put so much into practice as it pertains to hope.
Okay. Well, first of all, very much thanks, really, for this opportunity. I want to say a few things. First of all, I want you to just promise me that you're not going to press the kill switch immediately, because some of the things I'm going to say might sound a little controversial, and yet I view you and Josh as hope scholars. Okay, I think that you are just preoccupied with it, and I see you just thirsty to learn about it, and I'm sure that's the case with your listeners. And I would imagine that 30 episodes through this, there's a certain maturity when it comes to this topic, and I'm going to play on that.
Great.
First of all, in oncology, it was very sobering as I would be listening to the way, my colleague would speak to patients. So, they would say, well, I'm off to this conference and, probably we'll hear some amazing things. Maybe I'll be able to come back with some, new therapy. Here's a secret. These conferences are great, but there's not a lot of breakthroughs. There's just not enough breakthroughs. I mean, there's progress every day, but it's not at the clip that you and I want it to be happening. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, I hear colleagues saying to a patient, well, we can try this. And if that doesn't work, we can try this therapy. And then if that doesn't work, well, there's always hope. What does that mean? Actually, if you think about it, what they're then saying is hope is defined as despair, because what that doctor is saying is I tried everything and now I got nothing. And I think that's a terrible thing to say to a patient, to use hope in that way. I think I think of what you talk about with hope strategy is that you're saying, hope as a passive concept, that's not going to be enough. Mm-hmm. But I think we can be hope activists. And I think that's where the excitement rests. And I say this based on work from, if you read some of the stuff, based on this guy, Rick Snyder, who was the chairman of psychology at the University of Kansas, and some of his disciples, including David Feldman from Santa Clara University and Dan Ariely from Duke. These are all people who have profoundly influenced me. And, I don't want to get too rigid about this. That's not my goal. I don't want to do for hope what, Julia Child did for cooking. That's not my idea here.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is, and even if you go back, this would be like a fun thing for maybe you to do. If you listen to your podcast and the amazing stories that are told, I think you can hear a lot of what I'm about to say embedded within those stories. And the idea is as follows. It's very simple. Snyder said, after he interviewed a lot of people who identified as highly hopeful, that's a concept, that there were 3 conditions that exist that allow hope to thrive, okay? And it's very easy to remember because just like in college, your index is often called the GPA. So that's the acronym, GPA, goals, pathways, and agencies. So I'll just take a second on that. Goals is to say, these are objectives that I want to pursue. Maybe it's that I want to start a business. Maybe it's that I want to get closer to a relative in my family who's been estranged. Maybe it's to get another degree. Maybe it's to cure my cancer. Maybe it's to have fewer symptoms from my cancer. But it's got to be a plausible goal. In other words, Snyder would say that if my goal is to win the lottery, okay, that's really not somebody speaking from the perspective of hope. But if it's something that's attainable, even if it seems a little bit outside of my stretch, then that's interesting, provided you have these other two elements. The second one is the P, it's a pathway. It can't just be some lofty idea, some airy-fairy thing that's out there. I have to think and devise a way to get to that goal, okay? So it could be, let's say, I want to start this business and my pathway is going to be getting an MBA. It could be, I want to lose weight and my pathway is this diet. But whatever it might be, you have to have sort of a way to reach the goal with the understanding, because we're adults, that along any pathway there are obstacles. And that's where hopeful thinking and creative thinking comes in that when and you've said this multiple times, when I encounter an obstacle, that's a challenge. I have to then figure out how to either circumvent it, if it's an external obstacle, or if it's, let's say, an internal obstacle, meaning, let's say, jealousy or anger, then I would say what we have to do is learn how to dance with that obstacle, learn how to coexist with it so that it doesn't really pull me down. And then the third thing, and this is a very difficult term for people to understand, but you guys use it all the time because of your business, is agency. I mean, you understand what agency means, but the average English speaker doesn't. I didn't really know what it meant until I started reading it. And what's meant by agency is some combination of motivation, of drive, of tenacity, whatever your word is, to set out on that pathway. But also, it's inventiveness, it's imagination. It's to be able to say that, I can potentially do that. And when you put that all together, when I have an attainable goal, a pathway to get there, albeit with obstacles, and just this drive to set out on it, those are the conditions that allow hope to thrive. And those are, when people are speaking about their hopes, very often the things that pop out. Even though they wouldn't use the GPA concept, you would hear that.
With agency, just one thing on agency, is it the freedom to choose? I mean, and then all that comes with that? Is that, because that's one of the ways that I've looked at agency.
For sure, it's definitely part of it is giving yourself the latitude that you can go left or you can go right, and you can make that work for you. That you don't feel shackled. One of the reasons patients with cancer love this idea of hopefulness, which sometimes can be hope for cure, but not necessarily. It could be. I mean, I was working with somebody a few days ago who just once literally is hopeful that she can have a good bowel movement. And that's really where she's at. That's what she wants. And, we're doing things to help get her there. But it's an amazing thing when you have this hopeful way of thinking, and you've talked about Covey and how, he encouraged us to really understand where other people are coming from. Sometimes I'll be in a conference and I'll hear something, and I assume that everyone's intentions are good. And when I behold what they're saying, I will almost layer on the goals, pathways, and agencies, and then I'll understand where they're coming from within a hopeful mindset. And I can begin to interact with them and to challenge them. They can challenge me. And it's a very powerful tool, like we were saying before, with friends who are down. You could just say to someone who you're out having coffee with, where are you at right now? What's important to you right now, and aligning those values with those goals.
So how do you employ this, well, we'll call this itself a kind of this hope strategy, right? This approach to hope in a way that is giving meaning and giving incentive and coming up, like you said, with this agency and this inventiveness to say, okay, I'm in this situation. Now it's my opportunity to figure out left or right, or, up or down, or whatever it might be. So when you're working, as you've studied this and as you've put it into practice, when you're working with patients and things, what are some of the tools, or what are some of the processes that you use to help create hope and create hopeful circumstances? Right.
So we have two formal mechanisms. One is the idea of a workshop, and this is something that was really developed by this Professor Dave Feldman that I mentioned before, and that's based on literally a map Until recently, it was just a paper map. And we're finally, COVID has brought us in to this kind of a platform. So we're now transferring it to these Zoom-based workshops where literally in 90 minutes, we, give a little bit of the background on this stuff. And then we have people like literally buddying off and thinking about choosing just one goal, just as an example. We have patients doing it. We have physicians doing it. And that's always a confusion. Like a physician says, am I doing it for my patient? And actually what we do is we have the healthcare provider do it for himself or herself to just get into this mindset of choosing a goal and exploring the pathways. And then at the end of this workshop, we do what's called a mental rehearsal, where we literally will have you close your eyes, take a deep breath, and we have you, it's almost like a virtual reality experience, where we have you think about what your goals, your sub-goals might be, and we have you really think about accomplishing these goals and remembering just the sensual feeling of what it's like to check that box and to feel good about it, so that you can then propel yourself to do another goal. One of the interesting things that Snyder said is that this whole hopefulness idea is iterative. Now, we think of that term, we hear it in like the word reiteration. It's interesting, I looked it up once. Actually, reiteration, which people say to repeat, to iterate just means to do something again. So to reiterate means to do something again and again. But really, what Snyder was talking about as an iterative process means that there's a spiral. And the spiral can be a positive feedback loop where you choose some goal, which is attainable, and then that propels you to choose a slightly more challenging goal, and then on and on. It could also work, because this is real world, in the opposite direction. It might start spiraling down for you. And that's one of the things that we, as the teachers of this, try to do, to help you think about a goal that's truly attainable. So you can almost, break it up into bite-sized pieces, and you can score some victories, and on until you get to larger and larger goals. And I'll bet you that if you think about, your life, you've probably done that very intuitively. And it's just an amazing thing. And when we use, in one of the papers that you read, one of the articles, we talk about, where in the brain, where's the circuitry for hope? So there's a theory that hopefulness lies in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a structure that we know controls memory. So people always ask, well, if hope is so future-oriented, why would the structure that controls memory be implicated in hopefulness? And the answer might be that because one of the ways you become more hopeful is to remember, let's say, some challenge in high school. I don't know, it was the prettiest girl in the class, and she'd never go out with me. But, by golly, I asked her to the prom, and that worked. And everybody has, no matter how down on yourself you might be, has a few of those. And one of the things we do is we get you to recall what those moments were, because those will bolster you, those will buoy you up, and will allow you to get to that next step in a positive spiral.
It's powerful stuff. I feel like I'm in college again, taking a lot of notes. I think I've definitely taken more notes in our conversation than I ever have before. I'm going to say this now. We're going to have you on again if you're open to it, because there's again, the scholarly approach and understanding of hope is something that I've continued to seek out, and I'm really, really enjoying this, and I know people listening to are as well. Do you have advice? And maybe this is too basic of a question, but do you have advice? And this is more of the times we're in right now. But what I notice as somebody who, again, is hope oriented and again optimistic generally, when you see things or hear things the way that we do with kind of the state of the world and, in the US, the political situation and COVID worldwide, and, you're kind of, do you have any, because but what you just said, I can imagine ways that you could do this, but do you have any almost emergency button or the ripcord or whatever, like in the moment of despair, like in the actual moment when hope seems to be gone? Because what I've noticed, and it's so unhealthy, is that so much of, and we've talked about this with a lot of the guests that you've heard, but so much of today's culture, especially with like social media and the way that we communicate now, is based on fear, whether people know it or not. It's based on this lack of hope and this fear that their outlet is, well, I just heard all of this. I just was inundated. I told my wife early in 2020, I was like, we've been given more stimuli, or more information has been thrown at us. This was at the beginning of COVID in the last 24 hours that we are not built to take in. I don't have the knowledge. Everybody's expected to become an expert on all these things we don't know anything about overnight. It caught, I mean, obviously we see depression rates higher, suicide rates are higher globally than they've ever been. And so what I've seen is that a lot of people take this frustration and fear and angst, and they go to Facebook and they start saying stuff or trying to find an answer and a meaning in this thing from this news place, or this thing that this guy said, or this blog or podcast or whatever it might be. And they're trying so hard to find meaning. And it's so, if they think they're trying to instill hope, or I really think it's not that, it's based on fear. So in the moment of, I just heard this thing, this input just came in that is overwhelming to me, and it's causing me to feel a lack of hope. Do you have a practice or a habit or something in that moment that you medically know is proven to instill some level of hope in that moment so that people can kind of go through that exercise?
Okay, here's another somewhat controversial statement, although I didn't make it. It was made by the Dutch philosopher Spinoza. And what he said, and this is very interesting, is that hope is always commingled with fear. In other words, fear is out there, and it's a question of what you want to do with it. Fear and hope are the same portal. And the question is, how am I going through that doorway? Am I going through it just completely driven by fear? Or am I going to use these circumstances to redouble my efforts to say, what really is meaningful for me? COVID time, for me, this actually is something that I mentioned to Dan Ariely before. I said to him, it seems to me like the word of the year has been crazy. Like, how many emails, when somebody says to you, what's going on? You say, oh, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
He said something very interesting. He said, probably crazy is the way we're saying that we have uncertainty. Mm-hmm. We're not wired to deal well with uncertainty. We don't like it. Hope, as we're describing it right now, is a way to restore control. And because it says, I think I know who I am, I think I can find out what I want, and I can work on getting there. And when you do that, and this is why even for a cancer patient with incurable disease, they can still have hope. It's not an oxymoron. There's no contradiction in what I just said. I have many stories, and hopefully the book that I'll be writing, which are about people who die with hope, because we managed to speak to them about what it was that was so important. In other words, you and I, among other things, are bonded by the fact that we're mortal. Our days are numbered. We're not going to live forever. So that's part of everyone's experience. The question is what we're going to do with it. And sometimes if you understand fear and uncertainty, that could be what it is, the impetus that can get you to really do some of these things that you never would have thought. I mean, when I moved to Israel, I didn't have a job, actually. I mean, I left this really, high status world of people calling me professor, and I didn't have anybody yet offer me a place. And then all of a sudden someone comes up to me and says, why don't you get into biotechnology? And I was really scared. But I said, you know what? I think I'm at a point where there are certain elements of that appeal to me, my own entrepreneurial spirit. And it was really a kick. And so these moments of time, which can be very off-putting, can just be these tremendous opportunities for enrichment.
Yeah. And we're seeing both sides of that. It is a very double-edged sword, but so much of that comes to, again, one of the ways that I see agency, which is one of my favorite books is Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, that's my number one book.
Oh, it's the best. So, and how in the world am I?
Viktor Frankl.
Yeah, Viktor Frankl. I was like going with Alfred. That's not his name. Viktor Frankl. I just for Christmas for all of our employees, we sent them a little bit of extra money in order to support local businesses. And we put together a list we did some research on businesses around them and said, here's some businesses that we did some research on. And I wanted it to be emotional a little bit. So I said, here's the story of how they started. And, and we did that. But then I also sent them that Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. But his if you haven't read that book, go read it. It's a game changer. If it's Ben's favorite book, then it's a good one. Yeah. It's my top 2 as well. So it is, I guess basic synopsis of what Viktor Frankl comes to after his experience as a Jew in concentration camps, and then living through that after seeing everybody around him that he loved die in the worst way. And as a psychiatrist who turned this into an experiment of sorts to actually take, as dark as it may sound, but use this experience in order to, create hope for hundreds of thousands and millions of people in the years to come, is that between stimulus and response, man has the freedom to choose. That's it, right? We have stimuli, and I've said that word more on this podcast than I ever have before, but so many stimuli are coming at us. These outside influences are hitting us from all angles at all times right now, always, but especially in 2020 and into 2021. And our response is the critical next step. And between those two things, man, human beings, we are the only animal on the face of the earth that has the freedom or the agency to choose the next step. And if we can implement hope into that process, and how do we, this whole, GPA, the goals, pathways, agency, and start to define what hope is and implement strategies between stimulus and response, then the response will tend to be more optimistic, ambitious, hopeful, and productive.
I know we're out of time, but I just want to paraphrase what you said in another way to get people thinking with us. I would argue that because of what you just said, hope is a more human emotion than even love, for two reasons. One, we all know people, even though it's sad, who can live without love. But I challenge you to live without hope. In fact, many of the models where they ask physicians to predict, doc, how much time I have left, are dependent on whether people still have things to hope for. So that's one thing. And the second thing is there are animal models when you're like in the laboratory for love and affection. There is no animal model for hope, because an animal, just like you're saying now, is really incapable. They have some instincts, bears in the winter, but they're incapable of designing this type of thinking that you and Frankl speak about. We can do that. That's our blessing. Yeah. So I believe hope is the most human virtue.
I couldn't agree more. You, I appreciate you being on. I really, truly, I'm not just saying it, but let's stay in touch. We'll get a good email thread going back and forth, and
sounds great.
Let's stay in touch and find opportunities for you to, in any way that we can collaborate or, contribute on the subject as we're kind of, going down this road. I'd appreciate it. And seriously, it's a pleasure to meet you. And Josh just messaged me for our next interview, because this one wasn't on the schedule on accident. Anyways, he'll be on the next one, and he's going to listen back to this and say, man, I really
thanks so much. Thanks so much for sharing this with me.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. We'll be in touch.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy Podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy Podcast.